can make her look any way I want. Let's see. Hair, blue. Shoes, sensible. Body type, olive oil. Face, other. That's better. Now let's roll. Play.
Do people need to see themselves in a work of art in order to truly appreciate that art? We often hear praises sung of movies, shows, and video games due to the diversity of their casts. But does being able to see yourself in a work of fiction actually increase enjoyment of that work? Recent diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the gaming industry have been lauded by journalists and lambasted by players, with the appearance of many modern Western game characters being on the receiving end of harsh fan criticism, be it for reducing the bust size or changing the face shape of existing female characters to avert the dangerous male gaze, such as was the case with Aloy from the Horizon franchise, or Mary Jane from the Spider-Man game series, to the creation of new characters that are designed to represent every imaginable combination of race, sex, orientation, and identity, yet seemingly fail to appeal to anyone, such as was the case with the roster of Concord, to character creators that include options for everything from top surgery scars to alopecia to obesity to ambiguous bottom parts, such as is the case for games like Dragon Age Veilguard, amongst many other examples. Meanwhile, games from Eastern developers such as Palworld, Black Myth Wukong, and Stellar Blade have found massive financial success in the same time frame. But why? Does the appearance of characters in a video game influence that game's market prosperity, and if so, how? Do players really need to see themselves in a game in order to be good at it, in order to enjoy it? Or do players instead prefer to play as characters that look and act very differently from their real-world selves? Today, let's examine the effects of video game avatars' appearances on how players behave both inside and outside of video game worlds, how players relate to and interact with these avatars and the worlds that they inhabit, how avatars influence enjoyment of games, and even how games can affect how we see the world and understand ourselves. As we will see over the course of this video, the answer, as illustrated by data and research, not the oft-touted truisms of activists, is definitively no. Players do not need to see themselves represented in video games, and in fact, true representation may do more harm than good. So, let's begin this deep dive into the question of needing to see oneself in a video game by examining the Proteus Effect and how merely adopting a digital body can influence player behaviors. The Greek sea deity Proteus was a god of change and transformation, reflecting the ever-shifting and elusive nature of water, and was known to take many forms. Much like Proteus, video games allow us to embody many different characters of infinite forms and personalities. Games that allow for character selection and customization add an additional capacity for players to not just play a game, but to play with identity, exploring different selves based on the appearance of the avatar, the digital body. By taking on multiple forms like Proteus, do we also take on new attitudes and even new behaviors when we play video games? Can the very appearance of an avatar change ourselves?
Those are her confusion lines. And that just means that she's lived a very confusing life.
This phenomenon was described initially by doctors Nick Yee and Jeremy Bailenson in 2007 as the Proteus Effect, who hypothesized that players would change their in-game behaviors or even attitudes based on the appearance of the character that they were controlling. So, can the order of a collection of pixels change the way we act or even think? In their first experiment within the seminal study, photographs of the faces of 34 Caucasian undergraduate students were digitized into 3D busts and attached to a generic digital body. The attractiveness of these faces were rated by 14 undergraduates, using the mean scores to determine facial attractiveness, resulting in a total of 12 avatars, 6 female and 6 male, with 4 being unattractive, 4 being moderately attractive, and 4 being rated as highly attractive. A separate sample of 32 undergraduates participated in a lab experiment using a VR headset and were assigned to one of these pre-rated avatars. First, participants were instructed to turn around and view their avatar in a virtual mirror, and then face forward to interact with who they believed was another participant, but was in reality a research confederate of the opposite sex. Yes, they made their male participants talk to girls. That can't be ethical. How did this get past the IRB? I mean, the Stanford prison experiment was one thing, but talking to girls? That's like Tuskegee for League players.
All right, good job, guys. Good hustle. Meet you in the showers in 5 minutes. I want to see that butt.
I can take it.
Anyway, subjects were asked to first move closer to the Confederate within the digital space, illustrating how to control distance between the avatars, and were asked to introduce themselves to the Confederate, spending as much or as little time as they liked describing themselves. The distance between the two avatars and amount of self-disclosure that participants engaged in was rated by blind coders. They found that subjects with attractive avatars moved closer to the Confederate in the digital space and revealed more about themselves than those assigned to less attractive avatars, indicating that using a more attractive avatar seemed to make these participants more confident and sociable than those using less attractive avatars. Immediately then, we can see that there are social benefits to using an attractive avatar in a digital world. To expand upon these findings, in a second experiment, participants were instead assigned to an avatar that was shorter than the Confederate, the same height as the Confederate, or taller than the Confederate, and then engaged in a money-splitting game with them across 4 rounds, wherein one or the other proposed how to split $100. If the participant and Confederate were unable to agree on a split, neither would gain any money, and as such, cooperation was encouraged. Subjects offered a split in rounds 1 and 3, which the Confederate would always accept unless the split exceeded 90-10 in their participants' favor, while the Confederate offered a 50-50 split in the second round and a 75-25 split in the fourth round in favor of the Confederate. In total, those using short avatars were about twice as likely to accept the unfair offer, 72%, as participants in the normal 31% and tall conditions 38%. Although this effect did not emerge until after the first split, which may be indicative of participants essentially testing the waters of the interaction or of participants acclimating to the short avatar role. These results are indicative that not only does the facial appearance of an avatar bestow confidence in terms of self-disclosure and physical distance, the height of an avatar, comparative to another, can also bestow a sense of confidence, encouraging users to be less willing to accept an unfair deal when they were of the same height or taller height than another user within the digital environment.
There's so many short kings in this game, you can pick by your preferred size. Anything from 5'11" kings to a 5'10" pocket prince, who are so light at this point they get carried away by the wind.
The appearance of the avatar then actively influenced the behavior of the player controlling it, reflecting aspects of that avatar by adopting more social confidence when embodying an attractive or tall form in the digital space. What then would be the benefit of playing as a short, obese, unattractive avatar even if the player themselves fits that description? If you, as a game designer, journalist, or activist, want players to feel more competent and outgoing in a gaming environment because you are concerned those players lack efficacy or confidence in the real world for whatever reason, whether you think it to be systemic oppression or something else, forcing players into ugly, fat, or short characters is not going to help achieve that goal. If anything, it may cause greater harm to those who already struggle with socialization, at least in a social game, as seen in these 2 early experiments of the Proteus Effect. A second series of studies from Yi Bailenson and Duno, at least I think it's Duno and not Douchenut, sought to further understand this effect both inside and outside of the laboratory, and to identify if the social effects induced by embodying a certain type of digital form could scaffold into the real world. In their first study in this set, they conducted an automated census of players every 15 minutes across 3 World of Warcraft servers for 7 days to check the levels and races of online players. The races in World of Warcraft served as an appropriate, natural way of studying the Proteus Effect because they vary vastly, both in height and in attractiveness, with, at the time of this study's conduction, gnomes representing a short and attractive, or perhaps more accurately, cute race, dwarves representing a short and unattractive race, night elves representing a tall, attractive race, and trolls representing a tall, unattractive race. I'm not just saying these WoW races are more or less attractive based on my opinion either, but also on the reports of 22 undergraduate students who rated the attractiveness of the various races for this study. They found that for tall avatars, attractive races tended to be a higher level than did unattractive races, while for short avatars, unattractive races tended to be a higher level than did attractive ones. This latter finding may seem contradictory, but the authors suggest that small and attractive avatars appear as cute or childlike, and therefore less intimidating or powerful. Perhaps due in part to this issue, tall avatars were generally higher level regardless of attractiveness compared to short characters. While these findings are just observations of what races tended to be the highest level in WoW, they may be indicative that people feel that taller avatars, in particular, are more physically imposing, and as such, their players may feel more efficacious at the game and spend more time leveling up and actually empowering that avatar compared to shorter, less imposing ones. Their second experiment utilized a nearly identical procedure to the second study from Yi and Balanson 2007, with participants being assigned to either a tall or short avatar, and then playing a money-splitting game with a Confederate. But this time, the Confederate offered an unfair split to the participant. After completing the game within the virtual environment, the participants removed their VR headsets and were then seated across from the Confederate, such as to make the real-world height differences less salient. The two once again played the money-splitting game face-to-face, just as they had in VR. In the first trial, as before, participants who were assigned to tall avatars were less likely to accept unfair splits offered by the Confederate than were those assigned to a short avatar. But in the second in-game trial, avatar height was no longer related to accepting an unfair split, with the effect seemingly wearing off. Despite the apparent temporary nature of the Proteus Effect, real-world scaffolding persisted, as those who had been assigned to tall avatars were even less likely to accept an unfair split when interacting face-to-face with the Confederate. These results then may be indicative that even subtle changes in the appearance of an avatar may not only change our behaviors within a game or a digital world, but additionally, merely embodying a certain avatar can transfer of its associated traits, such as low self-confidence, into the real world, at least temporarily.
A gnome would sooner sell his own mother for a pouch of silvers than do a single good deed in his entire gaping hole of an existence.
Outside of joke characters, which are certainly bountiful in their own right, most players probably aren't going to want to invest a lot of time into a particularly ugly character. Not only because it's just unpleasant to look at, but because it may make them feel less sociable in a digital space, which can make games with social elements such as MMOs, MOBAs, and hero shooters more difficult for those using an ugly avatar. But perhaps more seriously, that lack of confidence may actually translate into behaviors outside of the game. If playing as a tall avatar makes people more confident both in-game and out, then clearly there can be some social positives for embodying avatars in a video game, even if it's just for a short period of time. The opposite then may also be true, in that playing as an avatar that is short, obese, ugly, or some combination thereof may reduce the confidence of those controlling it. Still, once more, the goals of those who champion DEI initiatives, being to make games more accessible to marginalized people and attempting to introduce them into gaming by offering increasingly diverse rosters of characters and avatar creation options that can allow them to perfectly see themselves in a game, may in fact actively make those who play as those characters feel less confident, not more. As I have found to so often be the case with such socio-political activist programs, those championing the cause are almost never familiar with the scientific literature relevant to the issue. And that goes doubly so for the companies that listen to said champions for the privilege of being, in the words of Sweet Baby Inc. founder Kim Belair, bullied into paying them for their services.
Put this stuff up to your higher-ups, and if they don't see the value in what you're asking for when you ask for consultants, when you ask for research, go have a coffee with your marketing team and just terrify them with the possibility of what's going to happen if they don't give you what you want.
Only to end up with massive financial flops on their hands, like Concord. To further understand the Proteus Effect on social interaction and the potential mediating influence of personal shyness, Beyond It All 2015 conducted 2 studies utilizing The Sims 3. In their first, participants were assigned to an avatar of the same gender that was either attractive or unattractive, and were given options to engage in virtual communication with a non-player character. Participants with attractive avatars were significantly more likely to engage in conversation with the in-game characters, regardless of their personal levels of shyness. A second study, replicating the first in a different game environment, found that shyness did moderate sociability, with shy participants being more sociable when using an attractive avatar than an unattractive one, while participants low in shyness using the attractive avatar were the most sociable, again evidencing the Proteus Effect. Across both studies, however, one result was consistent. People were less willing to interact with others, even NPCs, when using an ugly avatar, and this seemed to be unrelated to their personal level of shyness. Ugly avatars, it seems, do not facilitate socialization, even fictional socialization. Rather, they stymie it. But many games, particularly RPGs such as Dragon Age Veilguard, but also hero shooters such as Concord, as well as games of plenty of other genres, allow players to either create or customize their avatar, unlike the studies that we've just looked at of the Proteus Effect, which assigned an avatar to the participants. So does customization influence the scaffolding aspects of the Proteus Effect? To understand this, Rattan and Saw 2015 examined stereotype threat, avatar embodiment, and customization in a sample of female university students. Stereotype threat is a tendency to conform to negative stereotypes about one's social group in response to reminders about one's inclusion in that group. For example, in the seminal work on stereotype threat, African Americans performed more poorly on a standardized test when first asked to report on their race before completing the test, or when informed that the test was diagnostic of intelligence rather than just for fun. Stereotype threat has been examined in a variety of contexts, from Asians and driving competency to women and mathematical competence, the latter which was assessed here.
How much signal I need to cut across 8 lane? None? I turn now. Good luck, everybody else!
Some of the female subjects in this study were asked to make a me that resembled herself as closely as possible. Others were asked to make a me that closely resembled herself, but if she were a male. After making the me, a portion of participants were assigned to a generic male or female me to use in the subsequent swordplay game that all participants played for about 10 minutes. After playing the game, subjects were given a survey to complete that assessed their avatar embodiment, measured with questions such as, quote, "When playing the game, how much did you feel like your avatar was an extension of your body within the game?" Several pages into the survey, participants were instructed that, quote, "You will now have 5 minutes to complete some challenging math questions in your head. The scores of people who used male me's will be compared to the scores of people who used female me's, prompting stereotype threat. Respondents were then given 5 minutes to answer 10 mental arithmetic questions. The female participants in this study performed identically as well on the math task when they were assigned a generic avatar regardless of avatar gender, although they reported lower levels of embodiment when using the generic female me. Those who used a customized male avatar performed slightly better at the math task than did those using generic ones, but women who customized a female me performed the worst on the math task out of all groups. This effect, however, was mediated by avatar embodiment, as women who reported high or moderate levels of embodiment were as competent at the arithmetic test as were those who used other types of avatars. It was only women who did not feel embodied in the female customized avatar who performed particularly poorly at maths. These findings could be illustrative of a number of things, but what they do not evidence is that playing a female avatar or a male avatar inherently induces stereotype threat in women outside of the game. But why did women who customized their avatar and didn't feel embodied in that avatar become seemingly susceptible to the stereotype of women as being bad at maths? It cannot be that because the avatar did not look like her, that she did not see herself in the digital body, that induced the stereotype threat because the effect was not present for women using the generic female avatars. Instead, only when the avatar was customized by the female player and she did not feel embodied in it, that is, that it was not a representation or an extension of herself within a digital space, that stereotype threat was activated. Perhaps these women who did not feel embodied perceived the me as unattractive or as just not representative of her real self, given the limited options for customization and the cartoonish style of me's. But that is just a guess. Maybe the very act of having to think about customizing the appearance of the avatar to look like yourself made sex more salient and therefore activated the stereotype threat. I'm unsure, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. It's not as if me's can be sexualized, so that certainly was not a possible reason for this finding, with sexualization, of course, being the typical go-to answer for this kind of finding, at least from the activist class. Customization inherently, therefore, may present more of a potential for players to fall into stereotype threat than is a lack of customization, even if it's only in players who do not feel embodied in their avatar. As such, options for things like weight, skin disorders, transgender status, etc., when the player does not feel embodied for whatever reason, have a greater potential to increase real-world stereotype threat outside of the video game via the Proteus Effect than does a lack of customization. Now, listen, I'm certainly not calling for the removal of customization options from games. Far from it. I've always been fond of RPGs and games with character creators or customization options. But I don't play as avatars that look anything like me, and as we'll see later, that's actually not totally uncommon. When I make an avatar in a video game, when I have the option to, I will almost always make a female avatar with dark skin and white hair. Probably just because I love Storm from the X-Men, or maybe because I like my avatars like Guinness. Black body, white top.
Look at that. Full of iron, that is.
However, if the point of the addition of character customization options is there specifically to make women and marginalized groups feel more represented, well then, that could very well be a double-edged sword, and instead of empowering those groups, actually evokes stereotype threat. These customization options are likely completely inconsequential for most players, but for the people they are intended to help, they may, ironically enough, actually do harm. Much of the discourse regarding avatars and characters within video games has concerned how much the bodies of avatars can create unrealistic expectations for players that may negatively impact them due to their inability to live up to the idealized form of the video game characters that they control and often embody as a product of the Proteus Effect. But is there any evidence of that? The short answer is yes, but let's see how it actually manifests, beginning with a study from Sylvia King and Morse 2014, who examined how the muscularity of avatars influenced male players' body image satisfaction in a sample of undergraduate men. Participants' self-esteem, feelings about muscularity, and body self-esteem were measured, and then they played the Elder Scrolls Skyrim for 45 minutes, assigned to either an avatar of average musculature or with a muscle slider maxed out.
I didn't actually refine these muscles for fighting.
What?
This body of mine was really made to do this, for this beautiful person.
After playing, feeling towards muscularity and body-related self-esteem were again measured. Participant BMI and gameplay habits were also assessed. They found that subjects assigned to the hypermuscular avatars reported significantly lower body satisfaction compared to those using an avatar with an average build, and this was the case regardless of personal feelings about muscularity, both before and after playing the game. Significant research has found that avatars can serve as a motivator for positive lifestyle choices, such as eating healthy and exercising. And as such, I would suggest that these results, while they may make subjects feel dissatisfied with their own bodies, may also be a net positive rather than a net negative. Yes, it may decrease body satisfaction, but if it encourages positive change, and we know that there is a scaffolding aspect of the Proteus Effect, then I think it is potentially a positive overall. But that is just my opinion. What then, though, would be the effects of embodying a fat, unhealthy avatar? Well, it might make players less likely to experience decreased body satisfaction, but is that necessarily a bad thing? A meta-analysis of 17 studies from Clark et al. 2019 concerning the effects of avatar appearance on health-related attitudes found that studies that assigned participants to larger, obese-bodied avatars reported decreased intentions to engage in healthy behaviors outside of the game or demonstrated diminished performance in-game compared to those with smaller body types. In various studies wherein subjects used obese avatars, they tended to move the avatar or their own bodies less, typically in games that used Wiimotes, than did those using average-sized or thin avatars. Few studies, although not none, found evidence that the appearance of an avatar had any effect on real-world behaviors, such as physical activity or healthy eating choices. The effect sizes for customized avatars versus assigned avatars were generally weak, indicating that customization options were not a significant influence on these effects. Of course, this is a meta-analysis, so I'm just hitting the key points here, because this health-related research into avatars is actually probably the most commonly investigated topic within the field, but for example, Li Lewin and Zhang, 2014, tasked 9 to 13-year-old obese Singaporean children with playing about half an hour of a track game in Active Personal Trainer for the Wii.
Oh, so it's okay when they make a bunch of fat kids play sports games, but when I make a bunch of Ghanaian children play Minecraft, I'm being insensitive to their day job mining rare minerals for Tesla. Sorry to break it to you, Ubuntu, but that cobalt's not gonna mine itself.
Some students were asked to report on their height and weight before playing, activating stereotype threat, and were assigned either to an average or overweight avatar within the game. They found that children assigned an average weight avatar had more positive attitudes towards exercise, reported more exercise motivation, more motivation to exercise using the Wii, and performed better at the game than did those assigned to an obese avatar. When stereotype threat was activated, only gameplay outcomes, that is, actually being better at the game, became non-significant for students assigned an average avatar compared to an overweight one. Similarly, 2 papers from Dr. Jorge Peña found differences in actual physical activity in exergames based on the weight of the avatar used. As in Peña and Kim 2014, female undergraduate students played 3 sets of tennis matches in Virtua Tennis 2009 for the Wii, with accelerometers attached to the wrist and waist to measure movement, and were assigned to either an average or an overweight avatar, playing against either an average or overweight opponent. Women assigned an obese avatar engaged in less wrist and waist movement than did those assigned an average weight avatar. When playing against an obese opponent, those using the average avatars engaged in the least physical activity out of all conditions, while those assigned an obese avatar were more active when playing against an obese opponent, perhaps feeling as if they were more able to win against an obese avatar than one of an average build. Peña Khan and Alexopoulos 2016 conducted a replication of the 2014 study, but this time in a sample of male university students, and found that players assigned the average weight avatar engaged in more wrist activity, but not more waist activity. Subjects also engaged in less wrist activity when the opponent avatar was obese, particularly when the subject's avatar was an average weight. Across both studies then, participants assigned to fat avatars were less physically active. As such, across these specific studies and the meta-analysis which included them, we can see that the physical appearance of an avatar can have real physical effects on players, both in actual activity in exergames and attitudes towards healthy habits when using an obese avatar versus an average weight one. So while it is true that muscular avatars may make players more concerned with their own bodies, so too can obese avatars discourage healthy attitudes and even movement in those who embody them. If muscular or sexy avatars are supposedly a problem because of how they make players feel about their own bodies, then, well, the research seems indicative that such a concern does indeed go in both directions. Given the effects of the weight and musculature of avatars, what about then the sexualization of avatars? The source of so many complaints about the industry for so many years. Understandably, the group that has most concerned politicians, scholars, and activists alike throughout the history of video games and their associated controversies is adolescents. So, do the bodies of avatars potentially harm children's self-esteem, specifically by creating unrealistic body expectations and standards for women? Van and Bosch et al. 2017 tasked Belgian adolescents aged 11 to 14 with playing 15 minutes of RuneScape and assigned them to either a normally clothed avatar, either one of the same or opposite sex, or to a scantily clad avatar. Wait. What do you mean, scantily clad RuneScape character?
Be my GF now.
Sure.
I love you.
Give me more money, you simp.
Yes, honey.
Again, either of the same or opposite sex, and were surveyed on their video game consumption habits, the perceived gender congruency of the avatar they played with, normative sex roles, and self-objectification. It is important to understand what is meant here by self-objectification. The self-objectification questionnaire asks respondents to rate the importance of 12 body attributes on a scale from not at all important to very important, and includes coloring, measurements, muscle tone, physical attractiveness, sex appeal, weight, and competence-based body attributes such as health, muscular strength, physical coordination, physical energy level, physical fitness, and stamina.
Sometimes it's the person with the most stamina.
They found that participants who played the game with a sexualized avatar reported more self-objectification compared to those who played with a non-sexualized avatar, while gender congruency was non-significant, meaning that this was the case for girls who played a male avatar and boys who played a female avatar. The adolescents who used a sexualized avatar rated body attributes as more important than those who did not. But again, I have to ask, is that actually a bad thing? Certainly it can be, but thinking that physical fitness is important, which is essentially what the self-objectification instrument measures, doesn't seem that particularly deleterious to me, and we've already seen that it is not intrinsically. Playing as a muscular or sexy avatar increases thoughts about the body, but so too does playing as an obese avatar. So why is only one seemingly a problem? If this is the case for physical characteristics of an avatar potentially scaffolding onto beliefs about the physical body, what about the gender of the avatar? Does playing as a character of the opposite sex change the way that players behave? Can we solve sexism by adding more unsexualized female characters for men to play as in video games? I mean, that's what we're constantly told. But are there any data to back that assumption up? Marty et al. 2013, in a study with one of the most amusing titles I've ever encountered, Dwarf Acts Like a Lady, examined the behaviors of players who engaged in gender switching within World of Warcraft using a minigame played between 3 to 5 players for 2 hours. Chat, movement, and avatar appearance during the interaction were cataloged, and subsequently, player behavior, gesture use, disclosure type, for example directives or flirtation, and chat characteristics, for example, punctuation or emoticons, as well as the levels of femininity and masculinity using the BEM sexual inventory, which I have many issues with, but it's what was used here, were analyzed, and the self-selected sex of the players was compared to the sex of their avatar. Given that only 7 female players used male avatars, they were excluded from further analysis. Initial survey findings conducted before the minigame interaction revealed that men were more likely to use opposite-sex avatars than were women, 35% compared to only 10%, which is already indicative that women don't seem too keen on playing male avatars when given an option. Levels of masculinity and femininity were unrelated to both player and avatar sex for men and women players. Male players, regardless of avatar sex, tended to jump more, used fewer encouraging statements, select avatars with less attractive faces, recall 65% of men in this sample did not engage in gender swapping, and spread out less during play. Masculinity scores, both for men and for women, were related to less use of punctuation, fewer smile gestures, less flirtation, more combat, greater use of player names, and more action-oriented language. Men's play styles remained largely homogeneous regardless of avatar sex. However, men playing as female avatars tended to select avatars with more attractive faces. Regarding sex roles, men using female avatars adopted more feminine behaviors, acting more flirtatious, using more punctuation, and tending to stay back and let others lead the group into new areas.
AGP, 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 AGP!
Simply playing as a female avatar then can change the way that men behave in a video game, adopting stereotypes of feminine behavior, and although not assessed here in detail, we could surmise that the same may be the case for the few female players who choose to use male avatars, adopting more stereotypically masculine behaviors as a product of the Proteus Effect. Beyond social behaviors within a game, actual gameplay behaviors are also subject to this effect, as seen in a study from Yi et al. 2011 in a sample of WoW players who were asked to rate their preference for 6 different activities within the game for men and for women, including tanking, player versus player combat, PvP, melee damage, range damage, crafting, and healing. Initial testing revealed that healing was seen as a uniquely female activity, while PvP was seen as a uniquely male activity. With this in mind, a second sample of WoW players were asked to list up to 6 tunes that they actively used, and the researchers collected information on these avatars using the WoW Armory over a 5-month period. Total amount healed versus total damage dealt, as well as PvP kills versus total kills for the primary avatar used by each participant were measured. In this sample, over 53% of men used at least one female tune, with an average of 33.4% of their tunes being female, while in contrast, only 18.5% of women had at least one male tune, with an average of 9% of their tunes being male, again illustrating that women are considerably less likely to use male avatars than men are to use female avatars. Why is this finding so consistent? Well, I don't have data to specifically back that ass up, but I think we know why men use more female avatars, and it's not because they're particularly dying to enact female stereotypes.
Boobs, mainly. Boobs and titties and butts. Those are my favorite.
Anyway, for healing behaviors, player gender was non-significant. That is, men healed just as much as did women, however, character gender was significant, as female tunes healed considerably more than did male ones, and this was the case regardless of the sex of the player controlling the avatar. For PvP behavior, men tended to engage in more PvP, but the difference did not reach statistical significance. Once again, though, there was a significant difference when looking at the gender of the avatars, as male tunes engaged in more PvP than did female ones. Once again, then, we can see that through the Proteus Effect, players comport to stereotypes and expectations set by the appearance of the avatars that they utilize in digital worlds and video games, ranging from facial attractiveness to physical size to avatar sex. The avatars that we use change the way we interact and play, and therefore, the appearance of an avatar can have significant influence on how people play video games, and even their desire to play as certain characters or play certain games at all. Perhaps subconsciously, even outside of finding an avatar visually interesting, we all recognize that when we take on the role of an avatar, that avatar's appearance can influence our actions within a virtual environment. And with this understanding of the Proteus Effect and how avatars and players interact with one another, let's go a bit further and look into how players form relationships with avatars, and how that can influence enjoyment and even identity. As we've already seen, players do not just interact with their avatars. The avatars interact back with them in a feedback loop as a product of the Proteus Effect. Thus, because these two parties interact, we could assume that there is also a relationship that can form between a player and an avatar. So, do players form relationships with avatars? And if so, how? Banks, 2015, identified a 4-point topology to understand how gamers tend to view video game avatars using a sample of World of Warcraft players. First, respondents were asked about the intensity of the relationship that they had with their primary WoW characters, ranging from viewing it as nothing more than pixels, to liking it, to loving it, to perhaps even seeing it as a child. From an initial pool of over 300 players, 25 were selected to participate in extensive interviews regarding their feelings towards their primary avatar, or toon in the WoW context, representing all classes and races within the game. Dr. Banks then used text analysis drawing from the interview transcripts to detect themes within participants' descriptions and identified 3 characteristics of typical human relationships present in the player-avatar relationships: self-differentiation, emotional intimacy, and variations in perceived agency. Self-differentiation refers to how players related to the avatar as being similar or dissimilar to themselves, such as using I or we versus he or she to describe the avatar. For example, Chris described his avatar by saying, quote, "He's nothing but an extension of my arm into that universe. He's not even his own entity. He's me."
I was driving through upstate New York and I saw a Tesla with the license plate, "I'm him."
Emotional intimacy included emotional or caring language, such as feeling a connection to the avatar, shared experiences, which was a feeling of having fulfilled objectives collectively together with the avatar, and relationship benefits, which could be strategic, completing gameplay goals, or non-strategic, such as feeling proud of the avatar's accomplishments. Perceived agency contained 2 dimensions: moral agency and functional agency. Moral agency includes the capacity for the avatar to make decisions and take responsibility, while functional agency includes actual input regarding who of the two, player or avatar, is responsible for, say, casting a spell or joining a guild. I know that a lot of this may sound really weird, but those familiar with tabletop RPGs may be more familiar with this kind of relationship with a fictional character that you do control.
I feel like I wear goblin flesh pretty nice. I can warp it into reanimated clown flesh in a pinch. It actually is quite the easy conversion. Hey Gideon, what's your favorite animal? Yeah.
Interviewees were also questioned about their gameplay motivations, including combat or competition, social play, identity negotiation, and sense-making. That is, using the game or avatar to better understand the self, as well as escape or segmentation from the real world. Dr. Banks found that players tended to fall into one of 4 types of relationship categories with their avatars: avatar as object, avatar as me, avatar as symbiote, and avatar as other. Avatar as object was the most commonly identified category, with players seeing the avatar as merely a tool to complete gameplay objectives, an object on the screen, and was the relationship described by more than half of the sample. In contrast, less than 10% of subjects reported seeing their avatar as other, as a separate being that existed outside of themselves and possessed of its own agency. Avatar as me describes players who viewed the avatar as a direct representation of themselves, and avatar as symbiote describes players who viewed the avatar as both representative of themselves, but also possessed of unique elements that did not represent the self, and instead represented another person, comprising the remainder of the sample. That is, most people tend to see avatars in games as tools, but a significant portion see the avatar either as a digital version of themselves, a combination of themselves and someone else, and a few players see the avatar as a completely independent agent that the player is merely assisting in helping accomplish their goals within the game world. Additional analysis regarding the player-avatar interaction/relationship, or PAX-PAR instrument, developed by Banks in 2015, was conducted by Banks and Bowman in 2016, using 2 samples of WoW players to better understand this phenomenon. They further broke down player-avatar relationships into 2 general categories: sociality and character attachment. Player-avatar relationships included 3 factors: anthropomorphic autonomy, which includes beliefs that the avatar is an independent actor that exists outside of the player, emotional investment, such as feelings of love or attachment to the avatar, and a sense of companionship, feeling as if the player and avatar know each other or are even friends. Character attachment itself included 4 dimensions: identification with the character, suspension of disbelief, care or responsibility over the well-being of the avatar, and control over its actions. They found a significant relationship between human-like relatedness, which is a sense of being able to relate to the avatar as one would a human being, and emotional investment, anthropomorphic autonomy, and a non-relationship with control, indicating that seeing the avatar as a being similar to a real person induced more feelings of liking or love for the character, perceptions that the character had their own individual agency, but was not related to a feeling of being in control of the avatar. Emotional investment and suspension of disbelief were the lowest amongst players who saw their avatars as objects, while anthropomorphic autonomy was highest amongst those who experienced a symbiotic relationship with the avatar, or who saw the avatar as a distinct person, while there was no difference between groups regarding a sense of control. That is, all players seem to understand that they are controlling the character on the screen. However, different players perceive the avatar as having varying degrees of agency. They also found significant relationships between social motivations for play, emotional investment, anthropomorphic autonomy, and suspension of disbelief with both immersion motivations and emotional investment in the full sample of players, and suspension of disbelief and anthropomorphic autonomy in just the WoW sample. Gender and average hourly playtime were significantly related to both the social and immersion motivations. None of the PAX par dimensions were related to gameplay motivations, indicating that the relationships between players and avatars are not associated with actual gameplay, but merely act as pseudo-social functions. Additional validation and cross-language adaptation of the PAX par instrument was conducted by Banks et al. In 2019, expanding the scale into Chinese and German. Gamers were asked to select their favorite MMO and think about their favorite avatar in that game. In the updated model, suspension of disbelief was replaced with critical control, which includes paying attention to consistencies and inconsistencies within the game world. Across cultures, Chinese participants scored the highest in reports of relational closeness, anthropomorphic autonomy, and critical control, while scoring slightly lower in sense of control compared to English and German speakers, indicating that gamers around the world experience some form of relational interaction with video game avatars, although there are some cultural differences. Across all three cultures assessed, relational closeness with an avatar was related positively to anthropomorphic autonomy, while being negatively related to critical control. That is, players who feel an emotional attachment to their avatars in MMOs also tend to believe that avatar is possessed of more human-like qualities as its own person, while in contrast, these same players tend to be less concerned with thinking critically about potential discrepancies or inconsistencies in the fictional world that their avatar inhabits. It may be that when people form a sort of relationship with their avatar, that relationship is more important than focusing on things within its environment that don't make sense, such as glitches.
You got this Cyberpunk 2077 glitch mobile. Your wheels about to clip through the asphalt. You driving a damn Decepticon. You gonna be on the highway and that will transform.
If I love my avatar and think that she is her own person, then paying attention to anything that might make her world feel less real could contradict those feelings, and thus it makes sense that those who see an avatar as a symbiote or as another person, more so than as themselves or as a mere object, would be less critical of technical problems with the game that could disrupt its verisimilitude. In the English and German-speaking samples, but not the Chinese one, relational closeness was positively related to sense of control, and while the relationship was also positive in the Chinese sample, it did not reach statistical significance. In contrast, anthropomorphic autonomy was negatively related to a sense of control across all cultures. Thus, even though players who care for their avatars and believe that the avatar is their own person tend to be disinterested in being critical of issues within the game's environment. Those same two factors are oppositionally associated then with feeling as though the player controls the avatar's actions. Players who love their avatar tend to think that they also have some control over it. Unsurprisingly, players who think the avatar is its own person don't tend to believe that they have total control over it, fully illustrating the PAX par typology. For a small portion of players, less than 10%, the avatar in a video game is a unique autonomous person with its own desires, and they, the players, are merely along for the ride on whatever the avatar wants to do. They are not controlling the avatar is merely using their physical inputs into a controller or a keyboard to enact its own will. People who love their avatars, however, may think that they have control over them, despite also being disinterested in inconsistencies in the game world, as are those who view the avatars as independent and as autonomous. To better understand the 4 types of player-avatar relationships, Lowell, Westerman, and Banks, 2019, surveyed American and Chinese MMO players regarding their relationships and interactions with a favorite avatar in an online game, as well as their sense of spatial presence, social presence, and self-presence. Spatial presence assesses how much one feels as if they are inside a game world, and was measured with questions such as, quote, how much did it seem as if you could reach out and touch the objects or people you saw or heard? Social presence describes to what degree players perceive virtual social actors as real ones, and self-presence is the degree to which players believe their experience in a digital environment represents their actual selves. Relational closeness, critical control, and anthropomorphic autonomy were all associated with spatial presence, again feeling as if the game world were akin to the physical one. None of the 4 Pax Par dimensions were associated with social presence, seeing virtual characters as real people. Relational closeness and sense of control were, however, associated with self-presence, again feeling as if the actual self was being represented in the game. And this was the case in both the American and the Chinese sample. For the Pax Par types, players who viewed their avatar as symbiote reported higher levels of spatial presence, perceiving the digital as the physical, and social presence, seeing digital actors as real ones, than did those who were avatar as other or avatar as object-oriented. Further, both avatar as me players and avatar as symbiote players noted a higher sense of self-presence being represented in the digital space than did avatar as other and avatar as object players. Finally, regarding cultural differences, for American players, those who identified as avatar as symbiote were higher in social presence than were those who identified as avatar as object. However, this was not the case in the Chinese sample. Thus, it is not just the case that there are different ways that people tend to view avatars, but interactions and relationships with avatars are also associated with different ways of viewing aspects of video games as well, including feeling present in the game world, seeing video game characters like real people, and seeing the self as represented within a digital body. For more detail, we can look to a thematic analysis of player-avatar relationships from Zolan et al. 2023, using the Proteus Effect as a framework for understanding these relationships in a sample of US and UK gamers. 12 participants engaged in 30 to 60-minute long semi-structured interviews with the researchers that used questions from the self-presence questionnaire, which includes items such as, quote, when playing the game, how much did you feel like your avatar is an extension of your body within the game? And questions assessing experiences of the Proteus Effect, which included items such as, quote, does your avatar ever affect your behavior inside the game? It's not unusual when conducting lengthy interviews like this, merely looking for themes, for studies to only include a few participants because of the amount of time needed to not only conduct the interviews, but also create a codebook and locate themes within the participants' responses. However, I should point out that this sample is a bit, well, let's just say non-representative. As of the 12 gamers selected to be interviewed by these researchers using a convenience snowball sampling method, 7 were male, 1 was female, 4 were transgender, and 1 identified as non-binary. Clearly, these participants are not a normative sample of gamers. Well, maybe League players.
Your Honor, League of Legends. Death.
Although I'm sure the sample is still far from diverse enough for the likes of people behind games like Concord or Dustborn. But when talking about gamers as a group, obviously this is not representative because Linux has no games, and a quarter of this sample are clearly Linux users. But what themes did the researchers identify in their 30 to 60-minute long semi-structured interviews with these particular participants? The authors identified 5 themes. Theme 1 concerned the heterogeneity of game worlds, that is, each video game can tend to be very distinct, be it in gameplay, story, setting, characters, etc. And as such, several participants mentioned that their relationship with an avatar or feeling embodied in a game was highly dependent on the game in question. Obviously, players are going to feel less present in an abstract or puzzle game like Tetris than they may in an MMO like World of Warcraft, a game with a story but with a silent protagonist like Zelda or the Half-Life franchise, or a story-based game with an established protagonist such as The Last of Us or Life is Strange.
You won't say it. Look at you. Say it.
Theme 2 concerned avatar attachment, with several participants mentioning specifically how an avatar looks. For example, participant 3 responded, quote,
it's fun to customize them. It's fun to make them look cool, like how you want them to look, and you do begin to form a bit of an emotional connection.
And while some may want to look cool, others, such as participant 5, described creating a character that reflected himself, while also expressing ownership over that avatar as his creation. Theme 3 largely described the Proteus Effect, That is, how embodiment of an avatar can alter behaviors or attitudes both inside and outside of the game world. For instance, participant 5 reported, quote,
"So sometimes the avatar has a very tasty hairstyle. So because it is in the virtual world, I try to bring it into the real world. So you kind of go to the barber shop and you just run that hairstyle. Yeah. And 2, take for example the clothing styles. Sometimes the clothes are just nice and decent. So you try to go out and pick some just to try and imitate the avatar."
Given that participant 5 was a 21-year-old student, I am very curious now about what kind of tasty hairstyle he asked his barber to give him, and if the barber did indeed just f his shit up.
Maybe you got rid of that old yee-yee-ass haircut you got, you get some on your dick.
The scaffolding aspect of the Proteus Effect can be further illustrated in a response from participant 8, whose avatar's in-game behaviors influenced his interests outside of the game, stating, quote,
"So, for example, I've been really into astrology and herbal, well, botany. I occasionally read science texts about plants, like harvest seasons, crop circles. All that stuff wouldn't have come naturally to me if I hadn't taken that interest in playing as this avatar."
Gee, I wonder what kind of botany our crop circle enthusiast friend is interested in.
It's important to not inhale.
Tell us the news, Alex.
So what is going on? Aliens are coming?
Well, let me answer.
Nibiru?
Beyond the Proteus Effect, some participants also described game transfer phenomenon, or GTP, which is the involuntary experiences of players such as hearing, seeing, thinking, and or doing something similar to aspects of a video game after they have stopped playing it, identified by the research program largely led by Dr. Orts de Gotari. GTP effects can include perceptions of seeing gamer tags above people's heads, user interfaces or maps in one's vision, hearing music or sounds associated with objects or places within a game, distorted perceptions of objects, mimicking or feeling the sensation of holding a controller while not playing, confusing real memories with game-related experiences, and quoting lines from games unintentionally.
"Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit. Then pay with your blood."
Orts de Gotari and Griffiths, 2016, also found that the occurrence of this phenomenon is exceptionally common, with nearly 97% of gamers reporting having experienced at least some form of GTP at least once. Illustrating this phenomenon, Subject 7 responded, quote,
"There are times in games after I've just been foraging for stuff, and I'll be going out down to town, I'll be looking in trees for birds' eggs and stuff like that."
And they say video games don't teach life skills, but one must be careful, as fall damage does apply in real life.
Right, don't put too much weight on it, right? Come on, man, put my weight! Right, I can't put my weight in the roof, it's dead fun, I can't hold on to it, what am I meant to do that? Oh, here I've been wanting for 5 minutes, you wank stain!
The fourth theme concerned the types of selves expressed by players in virtual worlds, which itself contained 3 subtypes: actual self, idealized self, and utopian self. One player, participant 6, mentioned making their avatars resemble their actual self, avatar is me, describing the process thusly.
"I want to experience that feeling that you're in the virtual world, so making the avatar looking close to my appearance is very special, because I can see myself in the virtual world. So yeah, it's fun."
In contrast, the idealized self, perhaps avatar symbiote, but not necessarily, represents aspects of how the player would want to look, and was described by participant 1, saying of the avatar's appearance as, quote,
"Making these characters were just like the idea of who I wanted to be. So basically being able to get closer to that ideal than I am in real life."
However, these categories are not necessarily mutually exclusive, as participant 6 also described creating an avatar that looked like his improved self, how he's always dreamed of looking.
Yikes! But you're even more handsome now!
Finally, utopian avatars are ones that are created to look in ways that are divorced from the player's physical body, typically in ways that would be impossible to attain in reality, with participant 8, an 18-year-old male, describing his experience as, quote,
"I think it's somewhere between my ideals and something completely separate, because it's a cat girl. You can't exactly create those in real life, so it's somewhere between an ideal, as in ideally what looks like every day, and something completely separate."
Worry not, participant 8, I'm sure there's plenty of work being conducted on trying to create catgirls in real life currently underway, courtesy of Elon Musk.
I mean, I did promise the internet that I'd make catgirls. We could make a robot catgirl.
The final theme was the relationship between how an avatar looks and its relationship to gameplay difficulty, A study I quite dislike for its poor methodology, but worth mentioning here, is Ben Morowitz and Mastro 2009, who tasked players with completing one of 2 levels in Tomb Raider Legends. One in which Laura is wearing a cocktail dress without shoes, having removed her high heels after infiltrating a fancy dress party, and another where she is dressed in tactical gear, and found that female players reported lower game-related self-efficacy. That is, they believed they were less able to complete the game competently when Laura was not appropriately dressed for the job of action and acrobatics. I will spare you my many complaints with this study because the authors contend that the results are indicative of sexist self-stereotyping, that women feel they cannot play games when the protagonist is sexy. Instead, the theme identified here by Zollin et al. Evidences my personally long-held alternative hypothesis. It's not about the character being sexy, it's about the clothing being context-appropriate. If the point of the game is to be charismatic or social or persuasive, then sexy attire makes sense for gameplay goals. While if the goal of the game is to shoot baddies, well, you probably want some armor, even if it's boob armor, or so I would suggest. In Zollin's interviews, participants indicated that this may go the other way as well, with their own physical limitations scaffolding onto perceived efficacy of the avatar. As participant 10 stated, quote,
"It's definitely, you do feel that kind of, I am the character is me, the character is very bad at shooting people."
Thus we can see, through this albeit limited thematic analysis, that players very much do relate to and interact with their avatars, both in terms of appearance and as tools to complete gameplay goals. Some players see avatars as digital representations of themselves, others see them as a totally different person, some as a mix of both, and some as nothing more than an object. But due to the scaffolding of the Proteus Effect, how does an avatar's appearance affect how people feel about gameplay experiences, actual gameplay outcomes, and social aspects of video games, when they do involve social aspects? We often hear that video games need more avatars that represent diverse groups of people in order for them to feel comfortable playing or even being able to enjoy a video game. Hence the push for fewer white, male, cis protagonists in favor of non-white, female, and transgender characters. But is that true? Let's begin to examine this contention regarding avatar embodiment, often posited as unquestionable fact, with a study from Walk et al. 2018, who examined if self-similar avatar appearance affected gameplay outcomes in a search and rescue game using body scanning technology. 33 pairs of same-gender friends were recruited via a Craigslist ad to participate in the study and were first questioned about their prior video game experience, including gameplay habits, how good they believed they were at games, and favored game genres, as well as their closeness with the friend who accompanied them to the lab.
I was just wondering if you wanted to hang out with me and smoke weed and fill our bellies with diet soda and play Burnout Revenge for the PS2.
After their full-body images were captured in a photogrammetric cage, the scans are modeled into the game and the friends were seated with their backs to one another and given an unlimited time to get used to the game's mechanics in a tutorial area. Players were either assigned to the model scanned from their own body or of their friend's body to use in-game. The search and rescue game was designed by the scholars for this specific study and began with players being contacted by a radio operator instructing them that they had 10 minutes to either save 24 people, a social goal, or 24 gems, a non-social goal, in a collapsing mine. The avatar's face was displayed in the lower left-hand corner with a map in the upper right. The tutorial explained how to control the avatar and how to use the game's map, which indicated 6 rooms that contained either people or gems to be saved, and required the players pull a lever to enter each room. Upon opening the door, similarly body-scanned avatars in the social condition performed a brief cheering animation before disappearing, while the gems merely disappeared. The game ended after all 6 levers were pulled or when the 10-minute time limit was reached. If players rescued all of the gems or avatars, the end game screen displayed the word victory, while if they failed, the end game screen simply read game over. After completing the game, subjects were surveyed on their levels of engagement with the game, enjoyment, frustration, avatar attractiveness, avatar identification, and their emotional response. Emotional response in this case concerned the extent to which they cared about what happened to the people or gems in the game. Only 3 participants managed to pull all of the levers in the 10 minutes allotted, and avatar appearance had no effect on performance, nor did the social nature of the game moderate gameplay performances. All subjects reported fairly high enjoyment of the game, but the appearance of the avatar had no effect on enjoyment of the experience, nor did appearance influence frustration. Gender also played no role on any of the assessed outcomes. Looking deeper into mediating variables though, they found that men pulled more levers than women, but this was only the case when men were playing as their friend, not as themselves. When playing as themselves, men and women pulled the same number of levers. Participants who currently played games in their free time pulled more levers, but even when accounting for their current gaming habits, the gender differences remained. Preferred game genres are broken down into 2 classes: casual games, which included puzzle, platformer, music, and family genres, and hardcore games. The author's description, not mine, which included role-playing, adventure, fighting, action, and sports games.
That's right, I'm a hardcore gamer. Have been for years. Tell anyone and I'll rip your tongue out.
The casual class was 86% female, while the hardcore class was 97% male. To absolutely no one's surprise. While hardcore gamers pulled more levers, there was no effective avatar appearance on performance, and given men's preference for hardcore games, this may be indicative that men's increased performance when playing as a friend had more to do with game preference than it did with avatar appearance. Further, there was no difference in the number of levers pulled between the social and non-social games. These findings, or lack thereof, may be indicative then that looking similar to one's avatar has nothing to do with actually being good at a game, nor with enjoying a game. The constant claims from activist developers and activist gamers and activist journalists that they need to see themselves in a game in order to enjoy it then are certainly not corroborated by this experiment. Just because there are fat trans people with alopecia in the real world does not mean that a fat trans person with alopecia will necessarily enjoy a game more nor be any better at it when they play as an avatar that looks like themselves. Players were assigned avatars in WoW All study, and while there certainly are many games with a stable protagonist avatar with little to no capacity for customization, there are also many games that allow players to change the way that the avatar looks, select their preferred character to play as, such as hero shooters like Concord, or to create a completely unique avatar, such as in the case in many RPGs and MMOs. Given that a seeming selling point of several RPGs in the last few years, such as Cyberpunk 2077 and Baldur's Gate 3, has been the inclusion of character creators with very unique features, to put it mildly, all now surpassed by Dragon Age the Veilguard, the latter of which appears to be very specifically aiming for inclusivity and diversity within the character creator, you must ask, is being able to create a character that looks exactly like you actually helpful for gameplay outcomes? Again, this is the claim made by activists. But is it true? Rahul and Sebrex 2021 recruited undergraduate students to play Wii Sports, some of whom were allowed to create a Mii avatar that looked however he or she desired. Others were asked to create a Mii that resembled themselves as closely as possible, while a third group of subjects had a Mii created for them by the researchers, either intended to match their actual height, weight, and physical features as closely as possible given the limited customizability of the Mii character creator, or intended to be very dissimilar to the appearance of the participant. All participants then played 4 rounds of Wii Sports Tennis, and their wins and losses were recorded. After playing, subjects were queried on their feelings of being present within the game, including identification with their Mii, perceived performance in the game, and perceptions of control over the avatar. Avatar similarity of the Mii created by those not assigned an avatar was subsequently rated by the researchers by comparing participants' actual height, weight, hair color, eye color, and ethnicity to that of the Mii that they had created. Interestingly, subjects reported that the Mii created by the researchers designed to resemble them looked more similar to their own appearance than the Mii that they themselves had created as self-representative. However, participants also viewed the Mii created by the researchers to not resemble them as also being more similar to themselves than the Mii that they made intended to be dissimilar. This may be because the participants were less familiar with the Mii character creator and felt less able to accurately make a character that looked very similar to themselves or very dissimilar to themselves, but I can't say for sure. Participants made Miis that portrayed a more idealized version of themselves, and made uglier Miis when tasked with making a dissimilar avatar, as evidenced by the differences between the appearance of the actual participants and their Miis, both those intended to be similar and dissimilar. Female participants were, on average, 17 pounds heavier than the Mii that they created to represent themselves, while male participants created a self-symbolic Mii that was about 1.5 inches taller than they were in reality. For the dissimilar avatars, 43% of females and 35% of males changed their gender, 39% of females and 47% of males changed their skin color, and less than 1% of all participants changed both gender and skin tone. Women tended to make their dissimilar Miis extra thick, weighing an average of 46 pounds more than the creator, and being 2.5 inches taller, while men's dissimilar avatars were less extremely removed from their own bodies, being on average 26 pounds heavier and 2.6 inches taller. In other words, both men and women tend to have self-serving recollections of their own bodies when representing them in a digital space.
What are you talking about? I was a nerd. You were a bully. We were all afraid of you. We called you the Whitehaven Witch. Lemon! Oh, Aaron, no.
Even when specifically instructed to create an avatar that looked as closely to themselves as possible, both men and women tended to idealize their me's. Women made themselves thinner, and men made themselves taller, while the researchers did not. Hence perhaps why the researcher avatars were seen as more similar to the participants' actual appearance than the avatars that they themselves made. Given then that so few participants also chose to make dissimilar me's of both a different skin color and sex, this also explains why the researchers' me's were seen as more dissimilar from the participants, just as the researchers' similar me's were seen as, well, more similar. In terms of performance in Wii Tennis, participants using these self-similar avatars scored 5.37 points higher than those using dissimilar avatars, and those using an avatar that they constructed themselves, rather than having been assigned one by the researcher, scored 4.16 points higher. Using an avatar of one's own creation, whether it was similar or dissimilar, always produced greater performance in the game. However, dissimilar avatars created by the researchers performed the most poorly out of all groups. Recall that the avatars players made for themselves actually tended to be more idealized versions of themselves, while the experimenter-created avatars were more accurate to reality. Thus, playing with an avatar that actually looks like you, the real you, rather than your idealized version of yourself, is what actually predicted higher scores in this tennis game. But hang on, because it gets a little bit more complicated. Despite performing better objectively at the game, participants who made a me to resemble themselves believed they performed worse at the game than did those who played with a self-similar avatar created by the researchers. While players may objectively do better when playing with an idealized version of themselves, they do worse when playing with a realistic representation. Yet at the same time, playing with a self-generated idealized representation of the self produced decreased perceptions of performance compared to a more accurate representation of the self. Perhaps more important here, though, is that players using dissimilar me's, either made by the participant or by the experimenter's design, consistently perceived themselves as performing better at the game than those using a me that looked like them, idealized or realistic. If the purpose of the inclusion of things like weight, disability, deformity, transgender options, etc. in character creators to allow players to make an avatar that looks exactly as they do in the real world is intended to make those players feel better about playing a game, or at least feel as if they are better at it, then these data illustrate that said inclusion will not aid in that pursuit. The people who will feel more confident in their gameplay are instead those using avatars that look nothing like their real-world selves. Even if they didn't actually perform more competently in practice, they felt as if they did. And if feelings are what matter, and that is what matters to the activist class, and let's be honest, it's what should matter when we're talking about entertainment, then being able to create a one-to-one copy of yourself in a video game will likely not make you feel as if you are any better at it. If you look like one of the characters from Concord or Dustborn, again, my condolences, but playing as one of those characters is not going to make you feel as if you are better at the game, and this goes even more so for games with character creators, such as Dragon Age the Veilguard. As in this study, players felt they performed the worst when they made avatars to resemble themselves. Further, me's that looked like the player were seen as more present in the game world, including identification with the avatar, than were dissimilar me's, whether they were made by the player or the experimenter, with similar me's made by players being the most present. Similarly, subjects reported a greater sense of control over a self-similar avatar and the most control over a self-similar avatar that they had made, with the lowest level of control experienced over the dissimilar me made by the researchers. To summarize these findings, though, when players make avatars with the explicit purpose of recreating their own physical appearance, it tends to be idealized, not realistic. And when playing with those avatars, they believe they perform more poorly at a video game, even if they identify more with that avatar and feel more in control of it. If you go into a character creator with the goal in mind of just making yourself then, that promised game-related self-efficacy, the feeling of accomplishment, may be diminished. The very people that these developers claim they are helping by including these diverse characters or options for things like top surgery scars, vitiligo, or obesity, are going to be the people who will feel less accomplished in a game by playing with or creating those characters that directly resemble themselves. I want to be very clear again. I have no issue inherent with adding all sorts of intricate details and customizability to a character creator, but the reality is, the people who are probably going to create characters with these features or play as these, let's just say traditionally unattractive characters, are not going to be the people they are intended to represent. Because if they do use and do make these avatars, they will feel less efficacious regarding gameplay itself. Further examining the relationship between avatar similarity to the player controlling it and immersion, efficacy, and enjoyment, Poleshna, Bushkowitz, and Schmiezgilska, 2022, developed a simple flash game, Characterium, which included a character creator with options for gender, age, skin color, face shape, eyes, ears, eyebrows, nose, lips, piercings, body types, from slim, average, fat, or muscular, glasses, hair, silhouette, and clothing. The Polish high school students who participated in this study were also given a pool of points to apply to a variety of traits possessed by their avatar: bravery, creativity, intelligence, agility, accuracy, sensibility, openness, courage, resilience, and perceptiveness. All traits considered mythical in Poland, or so I'm told.
Besides, only a game designed by nerds would have charisma as a fantasy power.
The game itself required the players to press the spacebar to jump up a series of bars while moving left or right. That's a change. I thought they were usually stumbling out of bars more than over them.
What? You drunk?
Not true.
I would just like to inform the viewers at home that I am, in fact, being held hostage by the guy who writes my jokes. Anyway, after playing, participants answered a questionnaire regarding their similarity to the avatar, game efficacy, measured here by the score attained, and feelings of immersion, measured with questions such as, quote, "To what extent did the game hold your attention?" They found no relationship between player avatar similarity and game efficacy, meaning players who made avatars that they felt were similar to their real selves were no better at the game than those who made dissimilar avatars. Relatedly, avatar similarity was unrelated to reported enjoyment of the game, but there was a positive relationship between avatar similarity and immersion. While players did not perform better at the game than they did at Wii Sports Tennis when their avatar looked more similar to themselves, once again, it also appears that game enjoyment is unrelated to looking like one's avatar, which may be because players did not feel more efficacious, as we saw in the Rahel and Sebrex study, although players in this study did feel more immersed in the game when they did resemble their avatar. It really doesn't seem, then, as if seeing oneself in a video game is in any way necessary or even related to being able to have fun with that game, which of course is ultimately the entire point and purpose of video games.
Players deserve to see themselves represented to the fullest extent in their game. It's not your game, it's Concerned Ape's game. You just have a license to play it.
Is the seeming lack of importance of avatar appearance universal, though? Or could there be a cultural component? Despite protestation from Western game critics, Stellar Blade was a massive financial success and featured a sexy but also unambiguously Korean protagonist, body scan from model Shin Jae-eun.
And I don't give a flying what IGN France has to say about it. Now, is it funny that IGN said the developers have never seen a woman before when Eve's based on a very real woman? Of course. And I'd make fun of them for writing this, but they already work for IGN and they're also French. I think God's done enough.
So while avatar similarity does not seem necessary for players to enjoy nor feel efficacious at games in the West, is the same the case for the East. An older study from Jang, Kim, and Ryu, 2010, surveyed nearly 700 South Korean college students who played MMOs and asked them how similar their primary avatar was to their actual appearance, how good they believed they were at accomplishing various in-game tasks, such as completing missions, fighting monsters, or leveling up, as well as their general self-efficacy. Again, the belief that they are able to accomplish goals. Of course, this study was conducted in between sessions of South Korean participants, making StarCraft unplayable for anyone who happens to live west of Seoul. They found that participants who reported that their avatar was more similar to their actual self also reported slightly higher mastery of the game than did those with dissimilar avatars. The high mastery group also tended to have higher general self-efficacy, meaning that more confident people also tended to be more confident players. Perhaps the difference between the studies focusing on Western nations and this study from South Korea is, simply put, the result of South Korea being an almost entirely ethnically homogenous nation, and as such, playing as an avatar that did not look Korean was uniquely detrimental to these students, but hey, that's just my hypothesis. It is important to keep this in mind, though, because there may be cultural cases wherein the physical similarity of a game avatar is more important than it tends to be in the more diverse West. If looking like one's avatar does not inherently improve enjoyment nor gameplay outcomes, does it at least have something to do with self-esteem? Does seeing the self reflected in a digital body improve how players feel about themselves, as again is so often contended? For answers, we can look to a study from Pringle, 2015.
What's wrong, bro?
I swear I don't make these names up. Citations are, as always, linked in the description. But be sure to tune in next time where I discuss a study from Dr. Chicken Crimpy.
Ah yes, Chicken Crimpy. The artist's choice.
Was that the artist's choice?
Artist's choice.
Anyway, Pringle examined the influence of self-esteem on avatar similarity in a sample of gamers and non-gamers using the Elder Scrolls Online's character creator, which allows players to manipulate 48 different attributes of the avatar's appearance. For those unfamiliar, the Elder Scrolls Online includes both human and non-human avatars, and players were able to create any avatar they desired, as well as select the class they would want to play as in the game. Participants' general self-esteem and body-related self-esteem, which includes feelings about various parts of the body, ratings of the perceived attractiveness of their avatars, perceived similarity of the avatars, gameplay habits, identification as a gamer, genre of games played, experience with online games, and if they played online games with friends or with strangers were all assessed. Additionally, subjects were asked to write a sentence explaining why they chose the race and class within ESO that they did. Multiple regression analysis, which allows us to determine how much one variable predicts other variables, revealed that self-esteem predicted reported similarity to the avatars that participants created, but only body-related self-esteem, not general self-esteem. That is, players with higher self-esteem related specifically to their bodies will tend to make avatars that look more like themselves. It is unlikely then that people with low self-esteem actually want to see themselves represented in a video game. If you actually look like one of the characters from Concord or Dustborn, again, God forbid, and you have low self-esteem because of systemic oppression or discrimination or whatever, as is so frequently argued by proponents of these kinds of character designs, then you actually probably do not want to play as a character that looks like yourself. Instead, people with lower self-esteem likely want to embody an avatar that looks very differently from themselves, as a product of that low self-esteem. These results were highly significant and indicated that as self-esteem increased, perceived similarity increased by 0.08, meaning the supposedly marginalized people these developers and activists and journalists claim that they are trying to help by being able to see themselves in video games are probably the least likely people to play as one of these more diverse characters. If a player has, let's say, gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia, I would be skeptical that, based on these data, not on my feelings, but on these data, that player would want to embody an avatar with top surgery scars, vitiligo, or cellulite. This kind of thing is fine in games like Saints Row that don't take themselves seriously and where the character creation is largely a joke. But when you want players to immerse themselves into a game world, to embody an avatar, they probably don't want to look ugly, even if, perhaps particularly if, they are unattractive or feel unattractive in real life. It seems then that looking like one's avatar doesn't really matter for enjoyment of a game, nor for feeling particularly good at that game, and that may be in part because people with low self-esteem simply do not want to look like themselves in a digital body. So we need ask, do avatars have anything to do with enjoyment of games at all? This question was assessed by Bowman et al. 2016, who surveyed online participants, asking some to name and rate a video game that they would describe as fun or as meaningful, and then complete the character attachment questionnaire, which includes identification, suspension of disbelief, control, and responsibility over the care of that character. Only control over the character was related to reported enjoyment of whatever game the participants in the study chose to think of in their responses, such that perceived control accounted for 11% of the variance in reported enjoyment of a video game. That means, however, that identification with an avatar, along with suspension of disbelief and responsibility, were unrelated to enjoyment. Thus, one need not identify with an avatar in a video game, which includes pretending to be that character or forgetting one's personal feelings in place of that character in order to enjoy the video game, and instead, all that influenced enjoyment was feeling as though the player was in control of the avatar, that the game wasn't broken and it worked and functioned as intended. Identification was, however, related positively to game appreciation, to a sense of meaningfulness, of eudaimonia, as was responsibility for the character. Together, identification and responsibility accounted for 17% of the variance in appreciation for a game. This is likely because character creation is a novelty, not a key part of most gameplay, and it's gameplay, it's control, that manifests enjoyment. This effect was more pronounced in male players than in female players. Given that the identification measure used in the character attachment inventory does not include physical similarities, I cannot extrapolate these findings to the appearance of an avatar, but what we can take away from these findings is that what matters for enjoyment of a video game is feeling as if the player is in control over the avatar, and what matters for a meaningful experience is identification with and responsibility for the video game character. While much of the discussion regarding recent video games has concerned the physical appearance of game characters, identification is rarely only ever physical, no matter how much some activists would seem to imply it to be the end-all be-all of importance in character and avatar design. So what about character personality? The characters in Dustborn aren't just physically unappealing, they are insufferable as people, whose powers include cancellation and bullying. There is perhaps a no better recent example than the colossal flop that was Forspoken, which featured a protagonist so obnoxious that she became an instant meme.
Imagine if in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker for the first 15 minutes was going, "This cannot be happening. A droid? A guy with a scary helmet? What is going on?"
This cannot be real.
If avatars don't need look like the player in order for the player to enjoy the game or feel good at it, what role does the personality of the avatar and its similarity to the player have on the player-avatar relationship? A conference presentation from Heart 2017 examined the association between player personality disposition towards the Big Five personality dimensions, their own personality dimensions, and the personality dimensions that they attributed to a video game avatar using the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim as a stimulus. Subjects were first surveyed on their Big Five personality factors, which are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience, and were asked to rate how ideal these factors were in general. The survey also measured personality traits, including talkative versus quiet, social versus reserved, and diplomatic versus brutally honest. Participants then created a character in Skyrim and played 3 hours of the game, after which they were asked to complete the Big Five personality questionnaire, but this time, describing their avatar, not themselves. For example, quote, "My character is the life of the party."
We gotta do something. Absolutely. You know what we gotta do? Toga party.
As one might expect, there was a strong correlation between participants' own personality profile and the personality factors that they perceived of as ideal characteristics, such that a highly agreeable person tends to see agreeableness as an ideal trait in others. However, this did not scaffold onto the personalities of the avatars, with the exception of openness to experience. And that makes sense given that the role of an avatar in a game like Skyrim is to explore. Of course the Dovahkiin is open to new experiences. That's the point of the game.
Come on, Walrus. We are going. We are going to Whiterun. I'm going to ride your glorious fat ass.
As such, an individual high in conscientiousness, which is a preference for order, tends to see conscientiousness as a positive trait. However, that belief was unrelated to the personality of the avatar that they embodied in the game. Thus, just because we value certain traits and possess certain traits does not mean we will want to play as characters that have those exact same traits. The high conscientiousness player may very well enjoy playing a being of pure chaos, precisely because it is a game and allows players to explore different identities via roleplay. The average player does not need to see themselves and their values perfectly reflected and represented in a video game avatar, and in fact, given that there was no relationship, oftentimes may choose to play as a character that has very little in common with their own personality. Players do not need be seen physically represented in video games then, nor do they need to have their personalities or their politics perfectly represented in them either. With all of this in mind, does playing as an avatar that at least mildly resembles you, say being of the same sex, have any effect on enjoyment of video games? Prashad and Sanders 2018 tasked undergraduate students with creating a character in Fallout New Vegas, and then playing the game, including a tutorial mission in the first session, an hour of free play in the second, and then for an additional 30 minutes in a third session, locking them either into a first-person or third-person perspective. After playing, identification with the avatar, the courier, was measured in 6 dimensions: physical similarity, homophily, which is liking due to similarity to the player, wishful identification, identification through customization, perspective taking, and general liking, as well as enjoyment of the gameplay experience and general media usage were all assessed. For those playing in the first person, the gender of the avatar compared to the gender of the player was non-significant in its effect on perceived physical similarity to the player. However, when players could see their avatar from a third-person perspective, avatar sex was related to increased perceptions of physical similarity to the players of the same gender, compared to those of the opposite one. Third-person players reported higher homophily, identification through customization, and liking of the courier when the character was the same sex as the player. In contrast, when playing from a first-person perspective, playing as an avatar of the opposite sex as the player produced greater homophily, identification through customization, and liking. In turn, liking the avatar and homophily were positively related to enjoyment of the game. Thus, players can certainly like using an opposite-sex avatar and feel close to it, but only when they aren't constantly being reminded of the avatar's appearance from a third-person perspective. When players can see the avatar, they tend to prefer playing as one that matches their own sex, liking that avatar and feeling closer to it, subsequently increasing their enjoyment of the game. So yes, avatar sex may be one aspect of an avatar that influences liking and ultimately enjoyment, again, the point of video games, having fun, but only when the player can see the avatar and is reminded of its sex comparative to that of the player constantly. Otherwise, when playing from a first-person perspective, both men and women can enjoy a game equally regardless of the sex of their avatar. As such, something extremely general, such as avatar sex, may increase liking of an avatar of the same category when players can see it, but it seems, from the wealth of data available, that looking exactly like one's avatar at best is unrelated to enjoyment or to gameplay outcomes, and at worst is deleterious to both. People do not play games to be themselves. They play games as a form of escapism, to experience something they cannot be in the real world. So, just what are the effects of avatar appearance and embodiment, both within a game world and in the real one? To begin to understand the actual outcomes of using avatars of differing appearances, we can look to a master's thesis from Bowers 2018 that utilized both the theoretical frameworks of the Pax Par and the Proteus Effect to explore how avatar appearance would influence pro and antisocial play. Over 1,000 participants recruited from the WoW subreddit, and having collected participants and data from that same pool for my research, I can only say, oof.
I see you're a man of culture. I think you just won the internet, my friend. My good sir.
Anyway, the Redditors provided Bowers with their primary avatar's information so that it could be tracked, including total damage done, total healing done, total number of player kills, and number of overall kills. Participant motivations for play, including socializing, relationships, teamwork, and competing, pack/par with their avatar, physical appearance of the avatar, and role of the avatar were all assessed. Bowers found a positive correlation between the healing to damage ratio and the socializing, relational, and teamwork motivations for play. For avatars in the tank role, healing to damage was associated with more teamwork, while for avatars in the healer role, healing to damage was associated with more socialization motives. In contrast, an avatar's PvP to kill ratio was associated with competition motives for play. Avatar attractiveness was positively correlated with the healing to damage ratio, as well as the socializing and relationship motivations, while there was a negative correlation between avatar attractiveness and the PvP to kill ratio. That is, more attractive avatars healed more, and less attractive avatars killed other players more. Female avatars possessed a higher healing to damage ratio, as well as reported a stronger relationship and teamwork motivation to play than did male avatars. Avatar gender was unrelated to socialization motives for play. There was also no relationship between the PvP to kill ratios and competition motives to avatar gender, which may be because of the significant number of male players who use female avatars. Bigger avatars tended to heal less and engage in less teamwork, and instead tended to engage in more PvP and more competition. Even clothing had an effect, as avatars wearing lighter colored gear healed more and engaged in more teamwork, while those wearing darker colored gear engaged in more PvP.
Is it metal to have easily avoidable work-related accidents the cause of death? Yeah, again, metal. Is it metal for none of you to care at all?
Yeah, it's way more metal if we don't care about it.
Concerning the Pax Par dimensions, emotional investment, avatar role, suspension of disbelief, and avatar attractiveness were related to socializing motivations. Emotional investment, avatar sex, suspension of disbelief, and avatar size were related to relational motivations. Avatar role, emotional investment, clothing color, suspension of disbelief, and avatar size were related to teamwork motivations. Finally, avatar attractiveness, avatar sex, sense of control, and suspension of disbelief were related to competitive motivations for play. In total, then, the appearance of an avatar can encourage pro- or antisocial behavior in the form of healing or player killing, with attractive, smaller, female avatars wearing light clothing engaging in more pro-social behaviors, healing, while unattractive, larger male avatars wearing dark clothing engaged in more antisocial behavior, PvP. In games with social aspects, be they MMOs like WoW, or even perhaps hero shooters that require teamwork like Concord, the appearance of the avatar can significantly affect the way that players behave when using that avatar. And, at least according to the data from this thesis, people using ugly avatars are less likely to be sociable in video games and more likely to be aggressive. Once again, sort of flying in the face of what these ugly avatars are supposed to induce on paper: compassion and understanding. If you want players to be more caring, team-oriented, and sociable, then give them short, cute females to play as. You want gamers to be nice? Let them be cat girls.
From the first press of a button to hovering over the available races, you saw this one and you just...
No wonder the characters in Dustborn are violent and bent on canceling others. They are the antithesis of that avatar type. At least the character design matches the gameplay in that sense, though, I suppose. Ugly, inside and out. The prosociality effect of attractive avatars may not be so simple, however. As we can see in Guingan et al. 2020, not sure if I pronounced that right, Guigon? Who tasked undergraduate students with playing a short segment of an RPG Maker game created by the researchers, wherein the player was instructed to fight a series of monsters along a straight path, taking an average of about 5 minutes to complete. Players were assigned either to a positive, heroic, attractive avatar, or to a negative, villainous, unattractive avatar, and fought either against positive, attractive enemies, or negative, unattractive foes, all rated by pretest for attractiveness and positive or negative valence. After completing the game, participants were given a survey regarding gaming in general, and while handing out the papers, the researcher intentionally knocked over a cup containing 15 pens, waiting 5 seconds for the participant to have the opportunity to get up and assist them in picking the pens back up, a common experimental measure of prosocial behavior. Picking up any pens, the number of pens picked up, and the time spent picking them up were all measured. After the pen task was completed, either by the researcher picking them up or the participant, or a combination of both, the subjects then answered a prosocial questionnaire, which included questions such as, quote, "I would volunteer to help charity if they needed my help." Players assigned an attractive avatar, whether they fought attractive or non-attractive mobs, took more time to pick up the pens than did those assigned a negative avatar, and similarly picked up fewer pens than those assigned to an unattractive and negative avatar, regardless of the appearance of the monsters that they fought in the short game. This study stands out as a rare example wherein the Proteus Effect was not present, and perplexed both the researchers and, well, me. The significant differences between groups indicates that there was an effect of the stimulus, despite the short duration of gameplay. So why did players given an attractive hero character not behave more pro-socially, more heroically, after the fact? The authors suggest that because violence was being enacted regardless of condition, that perhaps there was an incongruity between the attractive heroic character engaging in acts of violence, even if against ugly monsters, versus behaving in a pro-social manner. However, I can't say for sure. It may be that the players felt they had already done their good deeds within the game, and thus need not replicate good deeds outside of it, but that too is just speculation. Perhaps it was because the hero character was wielding a shield and that put players into a defensive position rather than an active one that caused those playing the unheroic character wielding a flail to be comparatively more active in picking up the pens. Again, I don't know, so let me know what you think in the comments down below because I genuinely have no idea how to explain these findings. What we can glean from this study, though, is that playing as an attractive heroic character does not necessarily make one behave more heroically outside of a game. Despite the lack of a relationship between avatar appearance and extra-game prosociality, the type of avatar used can seemingly influence one's physical body, as seen in a study of physiological responses to playing World of Warcraft from Lim and Soe, 2009. Some players were assigned an avatar while others were allowed to select one from a roster of 6 pre-made avatars. Upon entering the game, players met with a research confederate who walked them through a series of in-game tasks, including buying a specific item from an NPC, later trading the item with the Confederate, fighting bandits, collecting an item from the bandits, and sending the collected item to the Confederate. As always, I must stress that Confederate in research refers to someone working for the researchers, not this.
Advance the flag of Dixie, hurrah, hurrah.
And you can tell because the socks are clearly indicative that she instead works in IT. Before and during play, participants' physiological responses to the game, including heart rate and skin conductive response, SCR, that is the electrodermal activity of the skin, which can manifest as hair standing on end or as sweating, were measured using a sensor attached to the finger on the player's non-dominant hand. After playing, participants answered a questionnaire about the emotional arousal they experienced while in the game and the degree to which they felt present in the game world. They found that players who selected an avatar themselves, rather than being assigned one, had higher levels of skin conductive response, and this was the case regardless of reported emotional arousal. First-person versus third-person perspectives also had no effect on either SCR nor on reported emotional arousal. Those players who chose their avatar had an increased heart rate compared to the baseline, while those who were assigned an avatar had a decreased heart rate compared to basal levels. Participants who did not choose their avatars felt more present when playing from a first-person perspective than a third-person perspective, but there was no statistically significant difference in reported presence for those who chose their avatar between the first and third-person perspectives. Female players experienced more SCR when playing in the first person than did men, while male players experienced more SCR when playing in the third person than did women. While both sexes presented with a lower heart rate when assigned an avatar, it was only men who reported increased heart rate when playing as an avatar of their own choice. Finally, men enjoyed the game more when they chose their avatar, while women enjoyed the game more when they were provided an avatar rather than choosing one. So while yes, merely embodying an avatar of our own choice can actually change the way our bodies physically react to video games, choice in avatars doesn't appear to matter much for women's particular enjoyment of games. As we have continued to see over the course of this video, the groups being targeted by activists, developers, and journalists as in need of representation in video games, women, non-white people, people with disabilities, transgender people, etc., don't seem to need to see themselves in games the way we are constantly told that they need to. In fact, this study indicates that women prefer to not choose an avatar at all, and instead found the game more fun when she didn't have to make a choice about the avatar's appearance.
What do you want?
It's not that simple.
What do you want? What do you want?
I have to go.
If you actually want women to enjoy video games, adding a million bizarre customization options doesn't seem to necessarily aid in that pursuit. Given some people do tend to have relationships with avatars in video games, and that this interaction or relationship can influence everything from emotions to behavior to physiological activity, what happens when developers mess with someone's favorite avatar or character within a video game? The Last of Us Part 2 was perhaps one of the most divisive video games of the last decade due to the choice to have the player switch from controlling the first game's protagonist, Joel, to controlling the beautiful woman who brutally murdered him, Abby. Proponents of this choice lauded the game for its bravery in killing off the middle-aged white male character in order to replace him with the strong female character of Abby and teenage, now lesbian, Ellie. But how did character attachment and avatar embodiment actually affect people who played The Last of Us Part 2? Irby & Doe 2021, which sounds like a law firm above a pizzeria, recruited 12 international participants for hour-long interviews, with the requirement for entry being having completed The Last of Us Part 1 and playing at least part of The Last of Us Part 2, although the researchers included participants who stopped playing the latter so long as they had watched a playthrough of the full game. Yes, that really is how difficult it apparently was to find people willing to play both through and talk about The Last of Us Part 2. Perhaps requiring participants to play The Last of Us Part 2 to completion was considered an ethics violation via the IRB.
If I wasn't streaming, I wouldn't bother finishing. I would just go straight to a walkthrough. I'd go walkthrough, and then I wouldn't even watch the gameplay of the walkthrough. I would just skip to all the fundamental bits, and then I'd watch the ending and go, yeah, okay.
The scholars asked questions about the various protagonists, Joel, Ellie, and Abby, such as, quote, how did you like this character? How did you like playing as him/her? How would you describe your relationship to that character? And did something change in the way you think about the characters? The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and the authors utilized thematic analysis to determine commonalities across responses. Game satisfaction reports from these subjects were wildly polarized. with participant 5 describing it as, quote, one of the bravest narratives I think I've ever interacted with, while participant 12 described the game as, quote, emotionally abusive. Players who were resistant to the introduction of Joel's killer, Abby, reported consistently lower game satisfaction, while those who accepted Abby tended to be more satisfied. In other words, study finds people who liked the game liked it, and people who didn't like it did not. Stunning. Perceptions that the characters acted illogically or inhumanly also resulted in decreased satisfaction with the game. Only 2 participants of the 12 initially were accepting of the switch to playing as Abby, and 5, half of those initially reluctant, maintained that discomfort throughout the rest of the game. Participant 8, who had a lot to say, described their irritation with the character as a specific product of Abby not being his avatar, but rather that of the game's director, Neil Druckmann, stating, quote, every time I played as Abby, it was really tormenting. She was Neil Druckmann's avatar. I always felt like he was trying to artificially force it onto me, so I couldn't get any positive feelings for the Abby character, even if I wanted to. That's why it was tormenting and exhausting to play as her. No sense of immersion at all, end quote. Participant 8 continued, saying, quote, if Abby came up not as a playable character, but always on the other side, and the situation would have played out in a cinematic way, or so I think, I would have been able to relate at least a bit, but because the user was forced directly, I felt repulsive. And participant 1 elaborated upon this theme by asserting that, quote, when you don't want to do what the game wants you to do, it's just not a good game. Despite most participants being reluctant to play as Abby at all, some did come to find satisfaction with the game over time, as participant 5 described their experience as being, quote, furious with Abby up until I had to play as Abby. I mean, even through that, the first few scenes of playing as Abby, I felt I didn't really want to play as her. I hate her. She's awful. She's ruining the life of the person I've really come to enjoy, and now I have to play as her. But I think that's genius storytelling. I think it is a risk to tell a story like that, to kind of force the player into a perspective that they don't really want to be in. That's gutsy, and I appreciate that. Not everyone likes that, but I really like that. But the way of telling it, by kind of rewinding the clock, I loved it, and I think that's a really smart way of doing. Thus, it seems players were able to find meaningfulness, eudaimonia, in the character switch, even if it didn't produce enjoyment and was even uncomfortable. I do think it's possible to find meaning from a game that forces the player to do things that they don't want to do, such as the mission in Spec Ops: The Line that forces the player to kill civilians with white phosphorus, unknowing the target of their actions when enacted. Or the section of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain which similarly requires the player kill their own brothers in arms, infected with a deadly parasite, one by one, as they stand and salute him. Are these moments fun? No, but they can be meaningful. As to why players were so upset by this switch, Participant 7 described their issue as being due to the contrast between the delicate way that Joel's character changed and grew in the first game compared to the abrupt shift to Abby in the second. Participant 12 directly described Joel as his alter ego that he controlled to affect the game's story, and Participant 8 mentioned having an emotional bond with Joel as the player character and also with Ellie being on Joel's side, but having that bond severed when forced to play as a character opposed to Joel and Ellie. As mentioned, about half of the players in this small sample who were reluctant to initially play as Abby came to accept her later into the game, citing humanizing moments of her relationship with other characters and her fear of heights. Those who remained negative towards Abby also noted that the weak, untactical, even sloppy Joel that she killed bore no resemblance to the character that they had come to know and care about. In total, participants who tended to report feeling as if Joel was acting out of character were those who did not accept Abby and thereby did not enjoy the game. Even scripted avatars, pre-selected, designed, and written by a team of developers, can evoke a player-avatar relationship wherein the player feels as if they have a parasocial relationship with that character, and when said character, said avatar, acts in a way outside of expectations, it can cause significant distress and anger within the player, which is exactly what happened for many players of The Last of Us Part 2, and why developers are best suited if they want to secure a critical and financial success, despite the success of The Last of Us Part 2, to just maintain consistent characterization and probably avoid killing off embodied avatars that players have formed a relationship with. You know, just to be on the safe side and avoid the kind of controversy and ire that particular game produced. Despite its divisive nature, The Last of Us Part 2 still did gangbusters financially. as a long-awaited sequel to a beloved game wherein players likely expected, as we saw in some of the aforementioned responses to it, to once again play as an avatar they had formed an emotional attachment to, Joel. But do video game characters or avatars actually sell games? Did people buy The Last of Us Part 2 because they cared about Joel and Ellie, or because they just wanted to shank more mushroom zombies, regardless of the appearance or identity of the avatar doing it? Hannison Dickinson, 2019, examined the effect of sex of a game's protagonist on intentions to buy a video game and anticipated enjoyment of that game, and may provide us with some answers to that very question. Undergraduate participants were shown a series of 6 supposed video game protagonists, created by the researchers along with the character's name and a brief description of the game. Names of the protagonists were selected to be specifically feminine, masculine, or sexless, such as was the case for a robot character. After reading the description, participants reported on their weekly gaming habits and rated the avatar on its similarity to themselves, desirability, how much they liked the character, anticipated enjoyment of the game, and their likelihood of purchasing the game, the latter which ultimately should be the main concern of game developers, so pay attention. Male subjects who reported that they did not regularly play video games believed that they would gain considerably more enjoyment from a game with a male protagonist, but female non-players reported low levels of anticipated enjoyment regardless of the sex of the protagonist avatar. In contrast, both men and women gamers did not report any expected difference in enjoyment of a video game based on the main character's gender. Further, for players, character desirability and liking predicted purchasing intent. Avatar similarity, however, was unrelated to intentions to buy the game. In direct contrast, for non-players, and particularly male non-players, avatar similarity predicted purchasing intent, but not liking nor desirability. As such, the contention that men simply hate female video game protagonists because of sexism, as is so frequently and continually bandied about, is not backed up by the data, and instead is representative more of men who do not play video games, not those who actually play them and purchase them.
This game is made for nobody. Nobody will enjoy this game. I'm confident in saying that.
The people who care about how similar an avatar looks to themselves are not the people who buy and subsequently play video games. This is not speculation. This is not a truism. It is right here, black and white, clear as crystal. The people who are attracted to video game avatars that look similar to themselves are largely males who do not play video games. Men and women who actually do play games do not need the protagonist or avatar to look or act similarly to themselves. Instead, it seems the opposite is often the case, with players desiring to play games as a form of escapism from their real lives, and with games serving as a method of embodying and experiencing a totally different life from the one that we are accustomed to in reality. Non-gamers are the ones who seem to think that the similarity of a player character is a necessity for enjoyment and encourages consumers to purchase games, when the truth could not be further removed from that false belief. I know that this seems obvious to those of you who play video games, but understand what these data really mean. The people who are selling these DEI characters do not play games, and that is exactly why they don't understand them, nor what players want from them. These non-players running much of the industry are so focused on the appearance of avatars, of making sure humans of every shape and size and color and sex and gender identity are represented under the auspices of encouraging games to be accessible to all, because they fundamentally do not understand the appeal of video games, nor what gamers want out of them, regardless of player sex, and that is why they inevitably fail. People who actually like video games, both male and female, will have wanted and will want to in the future play games regardless of the sex of the game's protagonist, because they are interested in the game itself, not inherently on the appearance of the avatar being reflective of their own bodies. Those who like Half-Life don't care if they're playing as Gordon Freeman or Alex Vance. They want to play Half-Life. I would hypothesize that the majority, rather than a mix of players, would have enjoyed switching from playing as Joel to playing as Ellie in The Last of Us Part 2, if these data are accurate. The problem was switching to Abby, a character who murdered the protagonist. Gamers do not need to see themselves in video games. It is non-gamers who are preoccupied with how an avatar looks over how the game plays, how the story unfolds, and so on. Much like with Hollywood's ongoing failed attempts to get more women interested in sci-fi and fantasy, action-adventure franchises and films, the people making these decisions do not understand the medium they are working within, and hence why they continue to fail. Continuing on the subject of actually playing or paying for video games though, Wang et al. 2024 surveyed nearly 12,000 Chinese Genshin Impact players on ideal self-image congruence, measured with questions such as, quote, how much does your own ideal self, who you ideally want to be, and the perceived overall image of your favorite character overlap? Liking of their favorite game character, attachment to that character, and intentions to spend money to purchase their favorite avatar were also assessed.
I first began playing Genshin Impact because of all the cute women, then experienced apotheosis and a philosophical enlightenment through the death of my own ego.
Seeing the avatar as an ideal other, that is who the player would want to be, not who they are, was related positively to liking the character and attachment to the character, and while it was also significantly related to purchasing intent, this relationship was weak. Instead, character liking and character attachment, in particular, were strongly, positively correlated with purchase intent. As such, while people may be more likely to purchase a game where the main character or character options allow them to create even an idealized version of themselves within it, if not a direct representation of themselves, as we've seen, that's not particularly compelling, but an ideal self, the relationship was far less potent than was just liking the character or feeling attached to it. Even idealized appearance has minimal effects on actual behavior that should concern the gaming industry, purchasing the game or things within the game, compared to creating likable characters that players can become invested in. We see here, as we have seen before, that people don't need to see themselves in a video game. They don't even need to see an idealized version of themselves in a game. They just want characters that they can relate to, that they like. And combining these data with everything we've looked at already, the characters that gamers relate to do not need to look like the player nor even be of the same sex. They just have to be likable, a seemingly insurmountable task for the modern Western games industry. It then falls on gamers, it appears, to fix the errors of the devs.
Sí, pero llámame Dante, el exterminador de demonios, ¿a que suena bien?
We've seen that games can be enjoyable or appreciated no matter what the avatar looks like, and that games can produce pro-social behavior and allow players to explore different aspects of their identity that they otherwise might be unwilling or unable to explore through the various ways that players interact and form relationships with their in-game avatars. And that largely, none of this, not enjoyment, nor embodiment, nor pro-sociality, requires that the avatar be a direct representation of the player in a digital world. But while typically, both as players and as consumers, fun is the most important component of a video game, hedonia, again, what about meaningfulness, eudaimonia? Because players can take on the roles of characters very different from their real-world selves, can video games and avatars help players not just in having fun, but in finding meaning in life? This question was assessed by Fraser, Slattery, and Yakovenko 2023 in a sample of Canadian adults who played at least 1 hour of video games a week for the last 3 months. Subjects answered a questionnaire that included a measurement of experiencing meaningfulness in life, searching for meaningfulness in life, gaming for escapism, identification with avatars, and internet gaming disorder, which describes intrusive or disruptive thoughts or behaviors related to gaming, such as feeling preoccupied with gaming, difficulty cutting down or on managing gameplay time, social dysfunction produced by gaming habits, and using games as a form of emotional or mood management. Finally, participants were asked to identify their favorite game genre and provide the researchers with some basic demographic data. The presence of meaningfulness in one's life was unrelated to escapism, but was positively related to identification with avatars, and to internet gaming disorder, both directly and indirectly as mediated through avatar identification. Escapist motives for play were also positively correlated with avatar identification, meaning that, in full, people who play games to escape from the real world tend to be more likely to identify with an avatar, but so too did people who find their lives to be meaningful. Identification with an avatar, in turn, was associated with disordered game-related behaviors. Even though these motives, meaningfulness and escapism, are seemingly opposites, as one group finds value in the real world and the other group is trying to forget about the real world, both groups have a tendency to see their avatars in video games as more than just pixels, and that, in turn, can produce a sometimes unhealthy obsession with video games. In contrast, searching for meaningfulness in one's life, unlike already having found it, was related to escapism as well as to avatar identification, and therefore was indirectly related through escapism and avatar identification with internet gaming disorder. Those still looking for meaningfulness may then engage in escapism in order to find it, and it seems that one way that players search for meaning is in avatar embodiment, exploring different worlds, scenarios, personalities, and identities. Favored game genre was unrelated to escapism or avatar identification, indicating that this effect is present across the board, whether the player prefers RPGs or FPS. As such, both those searching for meaningfulness in life and those who have already found it are more likely to identify with a video game avatar than those not searching or uninterested in finding eudaimonia. For those whose lives already have meaning, identifying as an avatar can allow that player to explore different aspects of themselves, or put themselves into the shoes of another person to elaborate upon their pre-existing sense of meaningfulness outside of the digital space. While for those searching for meaning, the same process of embodiment may allow them to similarly safely explore their identity and other identities in order to help them find meaningfulness. However, perhaps because of the very serious nature of finding the very meaning of life, when players use avatars for that purpose, they can tend to become obsessed with the games that facilitate that exploration. Similarly, those seeking to escape from the real world can find solace in being someone else in a video game, but this too can lead to disordered, obsessive behavior. Thus, avatars and the relationships that players have with them can have real effects on how people play games, how they behave in games and out, and what games they will want to play. But the avatars people tend to want to use are rarely the ones that directly represent them in a game world. People find enjoyment in games by being someone else, not by seeing themselves directly represented within the game. So with everything that we've learned, let's come to a few conclusions, based on data, not on the baseless claims of activists. Over the past 40 years, the gaming industry has grown from being little more than an extension of the toys industry into a towering behemoth of entertainment, generating an estimated $455 billion in global revenue in 2024, according to Statista data. 8 in 10 internet users between the ages of 16 and 44 play, and 9 out of 10 internet users under the age of 35 report playing video games on any device. The market is massive, and yet in recent years, much like with Hollywood, the industry has struggled with flops and fan backlash. While some of gaming's biggest failures of late are mostly free from politics and activist input, such as Anthem, Golem, or The Day Before, a plethora of financial and critical failures have focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, seemingly before gameplay, story, or characters. From Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League to Forspoken to Concord. While some games have been financial successes, the incessant focus from developers on DEI, funded in many cases by national governments, has continued to irritate the very people who buy and play video games, alienating the core audience with games like The Last of Us Part 2 and Starfield. Although the inclusion of pronouns, while funny, was certainly the least of the latter game's issues. In contrast, some of gaming's more modern hits have explicitly avoided politics and activism, as evidenced by the massive success of titles from newer or foreign developers, uninterested in playing by the DEI rulebooks followed by so many big studios, such as Palworld, Helldivers 2, Stellar Blade, and Black Myth Wukong. The huge profits these games pulled in is evidence that it is not video games as a medium that have suddenly begun to fail at attracting players willing to spend up to $80 for a product. People still want to play games, just as they always have and always will. Play is not a uniquely human behavior, as animals play too, but games are exclusively and intrinsically a human act. We are all, as Johann Huizinga posited, homo ludens, man, the player. Because games exist within a magic circle of arbitrary rules, they require players assume roles within that circle Be it as a pitcher on a baseball diamond or a knight in Dungeons & Dragons, games allow us to play not just for fun, but to play with identity within the safe confines of an ordered, rule-defined game that exists parallel to normal reality. Video games add various different dimensions to play, including avatars, that give players an even greater ability to explore different personalities, identities, behaviors, and activities that would not be possible to experience in the real world, and as such, it should not be surprising that players, whether they use games for escapism or not, want to use the technology of video games to do things that they can't, and be someone that they are not. As we have covered extensively in this video, players generally do not want to be themselves in a video game or in a digital environment. Players may make avatars that look like themselves, but typically it is an idealized version of themselves, not a one-to-one recreation or representation. Seeing ourselves reflected in games like a mirror also does not seem to be related to doing well at a game, nor to enjoying a game, which ultimately is the point of video games, to have fun. The mantra that games must contain characters that tick every imaginable diversity box so that every single person of every imaginable combination of color, sex, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and identity can see themselves in the game in order to enjoy it is fundamentally false. It is a lie told by activists like Kim Bel-Air and others at Sweet Baby Inc. to sell their services to developers, backed up by an endless money printer controlled by governments for the purpose of selling not games, but ideology that, in Blair's own words, must be force-fed to an unwilling audience of picky baby gamers. Due to the scaffolding aspect of the Proteus Effect, games and the avatars we embody in them can even change the way players behave outside of the game world. If developers and the DEI companies that inform them actually cared about improving the self-esteem of players, encouraging them to be more confident in themselves, then as we have seen, avatars should be tall and conventionally attractive, not short and intentionally unattractive, which is exactly why these games fail. Even the people who can see themselves in these characters don't want to be themselves in a video game, because very few people do. At best, they want to be an idealized version of themselves, not a realistic one. The very premise of DEI in gaming as represented by avatars and customization options like those in Concord or Dragon Age Veilguard is based then on an entirely faulty premise, utterly uninformed by data and social science research, because ultimately, the developers, and again the DEI companies that inform them, are woefully, seemingly intentionally, ignorant. But hey, what do you guys think? Have you ever experienced the Proteus Effect changing the way that you act in a video game based on the appearance of the avatar? Or the scaffolding of the Proteus Effect, feeling perhaps more socially confident after playing as a tall or attractive avatar in a video game, for instance? Have you experienced game transfer phenomenon, finding yourself reenacting in-game behaviors outside of the game world? Have you ever felt as if you had a relationship with a video game avatar, feeling as if you know it like a real person? How do you tend to relate to avatars in video games? As objects, as a representation of yourself, as a combination of both your own personality and someone else's, or as a completely separate entity? Do you select which games you want to play based on the look of the game's protagonist, or ability to customize an avatar? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, both because I am genuinely interested, particularly in how my audience tends to fall on that Pax Par typology, but also because it really helps this video in the algorithm so that it gets shown to more people. If you really liked the video, be sure to give it a like because that also really helps me out. And if you really enjoy my work, consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, linked in the description. By signing up for either one, you'll get access to my Discord server, where I preview these videos live with you all before they're made public, and just get to hang out in our little social science community. You'll also see your name listed at the end of every video, along with these fine folks here. If you would like something more tangible for your support, you can check out my merch store, which features this new design that I'm really quite fond of. All linked in the description, along with a full reference list of all of the studies cited in this video. If, for some reason, you would like to hear more from me, I do a weekly news and politics podcast on the Broken Crown channel with my co-host Spoon every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. GMT. We also host a Pathfinder game on the same channel every Tuesday at 7:30 p.m. GMT. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, dear friends, Altana Volt.
Yo, In the game of whoever I choose, it's just a Proteus Effect, I cannot lose. Avatar's looks, they're just for show. Skills in the play and in my flow. Player avatar relationships, it's all in my mind. Whether warrior or mage, I'm gonna shine. Don't need to see myself to get in the zone. The joys in the challenge, I own the throne. I don't need my face on the screen to win. Game transfer phenomenon kicking in. It's not about the look, it's how I play. An avatar's not just pixels, but I always slay. Jump from world to world, I don't need a clone. Space and social presence got me in the zone. From digital to real, the skills stay tight. Doesn't matter what I see, I'm still tanking the fight. Player avatar interaction, I make the rules. Looks don't define how I use these tools. Fun's in the game, not in how I appear. I'm winning this battle, no matter the gear. I don't need my face on the screen to win. Game transfer phenomenon kicking in. It's not about the look, it's how I play. An avatar's not just pixels, but I always slay.